Hi, this is Kalsifakowski, and in this video, we're going to be reviewing Units 1 through 3 for the Modified 2020 Coronavirus Exam. If you're reviewing this in the 2020-2021 school year, this is important to note that this is only covering Units 1 through 3 due to, of course, again, the coronavirus. So I'm going to really whip through this because it's difficult to cover 3 units in 1.5 videos, but we'll certainly do our best. Feel free to pause the slide, of course, should you want to look at more specific information to study it. So let's start off with Unit 1. And our big 3 theories are pluralism, where the idea where interest groups are equally competing. The big idea here is not one interest group is dominating over another. Then you have what's called hyperpluralism, where you just have way too many interest groups, way too many players in the game, if you will. And this is going to create policy gridlock, where neither one is going to necessarily be dominating, but it's going to be sort of at a stalemate. So with pluralism, sort of the idea that everybody's sort of working in tandem, no one's dominating. Hyperpluralism is that there's just too many players in the game and ultimately nothing gets done. And then you have the elite theory, the idea that really, for example, the top 1%, top 10% of society are the ones that are really making the laws and controlling society. So you have various competing views as to how democracy is working, or perhaps not working. Now, when you look at democracy, keep in mind that the United States is not a true democracy. This is more like Athens in Greece, right? We are a democratic republic. It would be too complicated to have everybody vote on every single thing. We're not all experts. We don't all have the time. So we have a democratic republic where people are going, or we're going to elect politicians to represent our beliefs. Now, it's important to note that these are the elements of our political culture. One thing that separates us from Europe is this idea of egalitarianism with respect to we do not, as the United States, believe in economic equality. Certainly we believe in opportunity in terms of equality, but not in terms of economic equality. That's a big, big difference in our political culture. Now, some of the foundational aspects of our Constitution, when you look back to the Enlightenment, you have Locke, right? Natural rights, life, liberty, property. That's going to be very influential, especially when you look at the Declaration of Independence. It's almost like it's taken verbatim from Locke. Also keep in mind that a precursor to the Constitution is some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. There's no presidency. There's no Supreme Court. States can coin their own currency. This is more of a, as it says here, a confederation, a league of friendship, not a country. Really, the states are operating as their own country. Now, the tipping point here is, of course, going to be Shays' Rebellion, when you're going to have a rebellion up in Massachusetts, and the state can't put it down, and they're looking for help from the national government, but there's no national military. So they're going to have to do the Constitutional Convention. And during this Constitutional Convention, where they're going to scrap the articles, they're going to create the Constitution that we know and love today, there are going to be some competing plans. And we have the New Jersey plan, which favored smaller states compared to the Virginia plan. And basically, we're going to take the aspects of both of these, the best aspects, if you will, and create them into this Connecticut plan, otherwise known as the Great Compromise. That's where we're going to have a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 chambers of Congress. The House that is going to be elected, and it's going to be proportional by the amount of people in your state. And then the Senate, which every state will get at least, or will always get just 2 senators. You also have the issue with the 3/5 compromise. How do you count slaves? 3/5, of course, is going to be the number there. And then, of course, political equality. In terms of voting requirements, this is ultimately going to be left to the states. It would be a little bit too complicated if you just had it at the federal level. So you have some state action there. Now, one thing that really encapsulates our Constitution is the Madisonian Model. We have a federal system between the national government working with the states. Sort of think about the coronavirus response with respect to ventilators, right? The federal government is distributing ventilators to states. States are trying to help one another and working with the national government. That's our federal system. We have checks and balances where neither branch is going to gain too much power, hypothetically, and can check the other branch, which we'll get into on later slides. We also have distinct powers for distinct branches, so the powers are separated, very much, encapsulating Madison's point of view as well as Montesquieu, going back again to the Enlightenment. And of course, this idea of limiting the majority control. Now, when it came to ratification, that was the difficult part, right? In many ways, coming up with the Constitution is the easy part, despite, many of the obstacles they encountered. But the only way that they were going to have the states ratify this new Constitution, this new document, is through adding a Bill of Rights, which was going to alleviate some of the fears that the smaller states, especially Rhode Island, had about this big national government. Remember, the states are giving up their rights that they had under the Articles of Confederation to an extent. So they want some guaranteed protections that state rights and individual rights are going to be protected. Of course, Rhode Island is eventually going to come on to ratifying, although they will be a little late to the game. But what this encapsulates is federalism, right? We have this power relationship between the federal and the state government. I like to, think about the federal government as the parent and the states being sort of the children. Now, just because you're a child or your state doesn't mean you lose your power, right? If you're 15, 16 watching this video, right, your parents give you some rights. You might be able to, choose what you want to eat for lunch, right? But when it comes to, let's say, staying out past 10 o'clock, well, your parents can restrict you, similar to the federal government. Now, when we look at the U.S. Constitution, it is the supreme law of the land, but it's not to say that the states don't have powers. Look at our 10th Amendment. They have reserved powers right to the states. So things like voting in elections are held to the states. Education requirements are state powers. Now, when we look at the power of the national government, it has significantly increased over time. You definitely want to consult these Supreme Court cases with Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, and Gibbons v. Ogden, as this is ultimately going to lead to the erosion of state power. Ultimately, the national government is gaining its muscles over the 1800s. Now, states are going to have a relationship with each other, full faith and credit, privileges and immunities, and extradition. So, for example, if you get married under the full faith and credit clause in New Jersey, when you move to California, California has to recognize your marriage in New Jersey. It's sort of, reciprocal. Privileges and immunities, just because you're in New Jersey and you go to Pennsylvania, they are not allowed to discriminate against you. You can't have certain rights being taken away because you're a New Jersey resident. And then extradition, of course, if you commit crime, you flee to another state, they have to ship you back to that original state. Now, when we look at types of federalism here, we have cooperative, where at this point, this is where the powers of policy are shared between the state and the national government. Whereas back in the day, prior to the 1930s, we had what was called dual federalism, where the states remain supreme in their area and the federal government remains supreme in their area. There was really no overlap, and that's going to end under FDR following the Great Depression in the 1930s. And it has ushered in what's called fiscal federalism, which is very much related to cooperative federalism, where the federal government is going to provide grants to states. And these types of grants are going to come with money. So with that, if it's a categorical grant, there are strings attached. It can only be used for this purpose. So, for example, money only for roads. But states tend to love what are called block grants. These are broad programs. States love these because think of a block of marble. The states are allowed to sort of shape and mold that marble however they choose. It's sort of like your parents saying, here's $20. Go fill up the family car with gas. That's categorical. Whereas your family saying, hey, here's $20 for your birthday. Spend it however you want. That's block. One thing that fiscal federalism is going to impact the states negatively is with respect to unfunded mandates. This is where the federal government is going to say you have to, for example, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, renovate all new, public buildings to accommodate people who are handicapped. So imagine what that means, installing elevators. Well, that's a lot of money to install an elevator, and the federal government is not going to provide any support. Now, since the 1980s, particularly under Reagan, we've seen the federal government transfer responsibility of policy to the states. So they're going to be giving them financial support typically, but there's not necessarily a guarantee. So the federal government sort of wants to stay away from implementing a lot of programs. So you're going to see even with respect to welfare programs, that's going to be shifted to the state government, and that's going to encapsulate devolution. All right, and now on to Unit 2. Let's go through this right now. And looking at the House versus the Senate, some very big differences here. Notice membership is going to be bigger in the House, smaller in the Senate. Notice the term of office, as well as some other important aspects here. Now, it's important to note that when we talk about formal powers, we're talking about powers actually specified in Article 1 of our Constitution. So notice some of the peacetime powers, post offices, regulating interstate commerce, a huge power there. But also during war, right? They have the right to declare it. Technically, the last time the U.S. Congress declared war, believe it or not, was World War II. So you'll see that these are the powers that are specified. So when we talk about formal powers, this is exactly what we are talking about. However, there are also implied powers that have strength in the national government, in particular Congress, the Elastic Clause. They have the ability to pass any law that they deem necessary and proper. What does that mean? That's very ambiguous. Another huge clause is the Commerce Clause, which allows the government to regulate all commerce between states. This does not get checked until U.S. v. Lopez in the 1990s, where there's going to be some pushback. But, especially in the 1900s, you're going to see Congress regulating anything that crosses state lines. That includes television signals, radio signals. That includes any product that goes between state lines. I mean, it is quite incredible when you look at some of the powers there. Now, when you look at the leadership here, notice that the House of Representatives is going to be led by the Speaker of the House, has the most powerful position there, third in line to the presidency. And their importance here is that they have a role in committee assignments. They also control the calendar. Now, when we look at the Senate, this is going to be formally headed by the VP. You do technically have a ceremonial position under the president pro tempore, but really the bulk of the power is going to go under the Senate Majority Leader. And again, they're going to determine the Senate agenda, the calendar. You typically are going to find more compromise in the Senate as opposed to the House of Representatives. Now, when we look at the committee system, this is where the real work of Congress takes place. You have standing committees. I would definitely be familiar with the House Major Committee, as it controls the flow of legislation, can kill legislation in many ways. Also, the Ways and Means, controlling the power of the purse. Authorization committees as well with respect to programs. And then in the Senate, the big ones, the Beyond Foreign Relations, Judiciary, Finance, those speak for themselves. Conference committees is when the two houses, or two chambers, I should say, have different bills on the same subject matter, and they're going to iron out the differences to make one bill. So that's sort of one of the final stages of a bill. And then sometimes you have what are called select committees, where they're going to investigate a specific issue, such as Watergate. That's a good example of that. They are temporary, hence the idea of being select. Now, some of the non-legislative duties, Congress does more than just pass legislation. They have oversight, right? Impeachment, they confirm appointments, treaties they will ratify. They can even fund or defund agencies. They have a lot of power over the budget, in particular with appropriating, allocating money, authorizing them. They also have things with mandatory spending, where they have to allocate part of the budget to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Like, they have to do that. It's part of what we call entitlement spending. But then a very small part of the budget is for discretionary spending, where the remaining money can be put for other budgetary items. But the bulk of the spending is going to be under Medicaid. Now, note how a bill becomes law. Now, since it's going to be FRQ based, you're probably not going to need to know too much in terms of this, but perhaps on a concept application FRQ you might, but just note, the general idea. You're never going to get asked for ultra specifics on that. Now, some of the influences on congresspersons, well, party polarization, right, where people are going to vote based on their party, also what their constituents want. But sometimes this is a great gridlock, policy gridlock, where nothing gets done. That's a problem when there's too much party polarization. And we are in an era of divided government, where one part of Congress is of a different party and the presidency is of another party. And thus, no party has absolute complete control of Congress, unless you're looking at 2016 to 2018, but that has since changed. Also, keep in mind that lame duck presidents, when they get voted out of office or their term is ending after 2 terms, where they really don't want to confirm, Congress doesn't want to confirm some of their appointments, so that sometimes happens as well. But also, do not underestimate the influence of lobbyists and interest groups in really influencing how a congressperson is going to vote. Look at some of the campaign donations that they're going to get. Quite incredible. Ultimately, 4 positions of a congressperson is going to take. A trustee, you're voting on the bill based on merit. Partisan, you're voting on the way that the party wants. You could act as a delegate, vote by the way the people want, or a politico, which is a combination of both the delegate and the partisan. Keep in mind, for House elections, gerrymandering is playing a big role here. Baker v. Carr is going to be very important because it's going to utilize the Equal Protection Clause, saying that basically every person has one vote. You can't have certain districts with more people or other districts with less people. Otherwise, that's violating your 14th Amendment right. Also, cannot be districts cannot be created based on race. That was a big part of the Shaw v. Reno case. Cannot be a primary factor, as the majority-minority districts also are going to be a violation. Final thing here on Congress is going to be checks on Congress from the president, veto power, appointment power, negotiating treaties, and of course judicial review with the judiciary. Move on to the second part of this video for the remainder of the review.